Hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Meredith, and I am the author of the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries. Today, it is my pride and joy to share with you a reading from Cupboards All Bared, Book 2 in the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries, now available in stores everywhere in whatever format you prefer. Print, ebook, audiobook, it's available in all. You can also pick up the first book in the series, Butcher, Baker, Candlestick Taker, which I highly recommend that you read before reading Cupboards All Bared. So let's dive in. Six houses down from the place Mr. London had stepped out into Hangman Creek, Bernard was finally answered with something other than "never heard of him." "Mr. London, ain't he the nervous fellow who was working next door for Mr. Campbell?" The gardener stood with an oil rag in one hand and a bottle in the other just outside Mr. Finch's garden gate. Everyone in Spokane knew which houses belonged to John Finch, William Wakefield, and Amasa Campbell, as they were three of the grandest homes built by Kirtland Cutter in Brown's edition. Bernard took a moment to admire the three houses, for even though they were all designed by Cutter, they were each built in a completely different style. Finch's three-story residence was completely white with columns like a Greek temple in the neo-classical revival style. Wakefield's was Mission Revival, with a whitewashed stucco exterior and an orange-tiled roof. Meanwhile, Campbell's three-story feat of timber and brick brought to mind the English Tudors. There was a main house, a clearly defined service wing to the right, and a carriage house tucked behind them both. Bernard gauged each of the entrances, the impressive, assertive front door that said, "Here lives a great man," or the more modest side door that led to the wing. He decided to try the humble door first, as he didn't want to disturb the entire household if Mr. Finch's gardener had been wrong. Squaring his shoulders and straightening his derby, he strode toward the door determinedly. After ringing the bell and knocking, he was greeted kindly by a housemaid. She was small and blonde, probably in her late 20s, with a nose and mouth that suggested to Bernard a Swedish background. Bernard introduced himself and handed over his card. The maid immediately invited him in. "Are you here to speak with Mr. Campbell? I'm afraid he's not in at the moment, but he should be returning shortly." "I'm not certain yet, to be honest," replied Bernard, looking around the small entryway. Across from him were several doors and the bottom of a winding staircase in the corner. On the wall to his left hung an annunciator call bell system, with a collection of labeled brass arrows pointing to whomever had rung for the servants. The maid reached up and pushed a small button hidden under the device, resetting the side door arrow that had apparently moved when Bernard rang the bell. "I'm looking for someone who knows a Mr. London." "Mr. London?" The maid turned from the arrows, her blonde eyebrows raised. "Mr. Campbell's assistant is a Mr. London, but he didn't show up for work today."
"Perfect. Could you describe him to me, perhaps?" The maid's eyebrows moved farther up, followed by her blue eyes as she tried to recall him.
"Tall, over 6 feet, I should think. Dark hair and eyes, clean-shaven. He wore round spectacles, and very nice suits for a personal assistant, but then he'd been sent specially to help with the preparations for the president."
Bernard nodded. Sounded like a match to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken pair of spectacles he'd found beneath the body. "Do these look familiar?" The maid flushed and put a hand to her pale cheek.
"Those look like his. Oh dear, what's happened?"
Bernard thought it best to avoid telling anyone the man was dead until he'd spoken with the head of the household, especially as the maid seemed to be nearing a fainting spell simply over spectacles. "I think I'd better talk with Mr. Campbell after all. Is there anyone else who worked with Mr. London, who might be able to answer a few questions?" The maid moved her hand to her chest and took a deep breath as if to steady herself.
"I suppose you might talk with Mrs. Campbell. Is Mr. London all right?"
Ignoring the maid's question, Bernard asked, "Might I see Mrs. Campbell?" The maid asked him to wait in the reception room while she checked to see if Mrs. Campbell was available. She led him through a side door into the main house, and he noticed immediately the darker stained oak paneling in contrast to the lighter pine that had marked the servants' side, something he'd also seen done in Miss Mitchell's home. Down a short hallway, he passed a large, open dining room dominated by an ornately blue and white tiled fireplace at one end of a long, shining table. They rounded a magnificent grand staircase that took a sharp corner on a midway landing, so Bernard could not see what lay at the top, passing a beautiful grandfather clock that told of the time, as well as the day, month, and location of the sun, something he knew Prescott would love to get his hands on. Turning back from the clock, he almost hit his head on a low-hanging, ornate electric chandelier at the bottom of the grand staircase. Clearly, the designer had not planned on men taller than Mr. Campbell passing through. The maid led Bernard down a small set of stairs into a foyer, reminiscent of a castle, with thick, dark oak beams crisscrossing the ceiling, and even an ornate tapestry lining the walls, depicting windmills and castle ruins amongst a forest of trees. It made him wish he'd entered via the front door rather than the back. From this vantage point, however, he could see an impressive suit of armor hanging above the front door, an odd collection considering it looked to comprise a Spanish breastplate and helmet, Chinese swords, Turkish axes, and standard gauntlets. Off either side of the foyer were two large pocket doorways. One led into the largest room in the house, a living room, filled with tables, chairs, a grand piano, and a cozy inglenook fireplace. The other led to a sitting room, a very unique sitting room. To begin with, it was pink. The couches were pink, the chairs were pink, the walls were lined in pink silk. Heavy, rose-colored velvet draperies, embroidered with gold filigree, hung across the leaded windows. The ceiling was white in contrast, sculpted with acanthus leaves, interlaced with twisting vines in an elaborate design. The pink was broken by gold filigree lining the cornices, the chandelier, the rococo curlicued molding, and the ostentatious white marble fireplace inlaid with rose gold scrollwork, above which hung a gigantic mirror that reflected all the pink and gold back upon him again. Now he knew some might think that Rosalind had gone a little overboard with the Swiss bear furniture in their own front parlor, but this right here was a woman's reception room worthy of Versailles. The maid bobbed and left him there, but thankfully for no more than 10 or 15 minutes before returning to say the lady of the house would see him now. She led him back the way they'd come and not up the grand staircase, which implied to Bernard that it led to private bedrooms. Instead, they crossed back onto the servants' side and went up the set of narrow, twisted, corner stairs he'd glimpsed before, causing him to wonder why he hadn't simply been asked to wait by the annunciator. At least this way he'd gotten a chance to glimpse more of the house. On the second floor, the door to the right opened into a corner room lined with built-in linen cabinets and filled with all the accoutrements of a sewing room, a model figure, a sewing machine, and more bolts of fabric than Bernard had ever laid eyes on. The sunlight was streaming in through the large leaded-windowed walls, caressing the bent shoulders of a woman in her early 40s, with graying sandy brown hair and a pompadour. She lifted her gracefully long neck as they entered, revealing a round face with a thin nose above thin lips. She was quite beautiful for her age, and had that delicate radiance of one who'd been breathtaking when she was younger, reminding Bernard of Rosalind's quiet beauty in some ways. She wore a high-necked, soft yellow dress that was modestly covering her neck and shoulders and displaying a rather impressive pendant necklace. A large sky-blue bow hung at the bottom of a chantilly lace V-neck that draped from her shoulders down across her chest as she leaned over an array of papers spread out before her on an oak table. Her gray-blue eyes rose to meet his, though it was clear she was still distracted by the thoughts tied to the papers before her. "Mrs. Campbell, ma'am," bobbed the maid, "this is a Detective Carew." Find out what happens next when you pick up your own copy of Cupboards All Bared, now available in all 3 formats. That's print, ebook, and audiobook, and through your local library. Be sure to check out the first book, Butcher Baker Candlestick Taker, first book in the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries, before you dive into Cupboards All Bared. I look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you so much for joining me for this reading. Bye.